Hello and welcome to our class today. We're still in part one of our adaptive parenting online course where we're focusing on understanding behavior. And today we'll be talking about understanding, accepting, and celebrating your child. How does it feel when someone stands out or looks or behaves differently? Today we're going to be talking about what happens when people don't fit the mold and how others respond. So I'd like you to think about a time when your child did not fit in. Maybe they were struggling to fit the mold. Maybe they did or said something that made them stand out or look different. How did you respond? How did you feel? Did it bring out discomfort? Maybe you wanted to run away or hide, or maybe you wanted to help or change something. Maybe you experienced some embarrassment or guilt or judgment about them or yourself. Or maybe you had a combination of all of these thoughts and feelings. So let's get curious about our own experience of how we respond to human differences. Those thoughts and feelings are going to show up whether we like it or not, but what we do with them is up to us. The topics we will cover in class today include influencing behavior, when to intervene, and when to not intervene. We'll also talk about ethical considerations around influencing behavior. And we'll briefly talk about the different models of how we think about disability and neurodiversity and barriers to inclusion. And then we'll talk about some practical ways to practice understanding, accepting, and celebrating your child just as they are. So in the first two classes of this course, we have talked about how context helps us understand behavior. And we've looked at some of those basic behavior principles and functions of why a behavior may be occurring. We have this scientific way to view behaviors. Those scientific principles and technology apply to all of us as humans. However, when understanding and influencing human behavior, we have to acknowledge that even though we all operate under the same rules, every person is a valuable individual. We need to see other people having their own stories and strengths, dreams and desires. Knowing how to change behavior doesn't mean that we should change someone else's behavior. We need to be extremely mindful of our own assumptions, preferences, and prejudice. The differences that show up in how humans behave don't always represent a problem or require a solution. So how do we know when to intervene? Your child has a specific set of skills and experiences. They have their own history, their own motivations. All of that influences their behaviors. And even though we have this reliable way to intervene on behavior and change behavior, it isn't always needed. Sometimes we as parents or as society need to change our own perceptions rather than changing our child's behavior. How do we choose goals and therapeutic interventions for a child that are appropriate and not going to cause harm? When we're deciding whether or not a behavior needs to be changed, or if there needs to be an intervention at all, we need to first ask, is there consent and assent? So children cannot give consent, but they can demonstrate assent in many different ways. And it's important that we respect all forms of communication and respect autonomy. Kids communicate with their behavior, and we should be attentive to their resistance. It's important to ask if a behavior intervention is for the benefit of the child, or is it for the benefit of those around them? If an intervention is only to make life easier for other people, then it's not appropriate. Any kind of behavior intervention must benefit the person first and foremost. This is what we mean by person-centered goals. If the goal is to get the child to sit still in their desk and stop wiggling at school, is the benefit for the teacher, for the classroom, or for the student? Because you may be able to get the kid to sit still and stop wiggling, but how is that benefiting them? We have to ask who benefits from the behavior intervention. There are a lot of ethical considerations when we're deciding whether or not we need to intervene on a behavior. When behavior scientists or clinicians or teachers or leaders possess this knowledge of how to shape and change behavior, they hold an enormous responsibility to use that knowledge ethically. Who gets to decide what is and is not appropriate behavior? Think about it. Who makes the rules about what's allowed and not allowed? And how do those rules change depending on the context? What behaviors were acceptable 20 years ago might not be acceptable now. What's socially appropriate in one culture might not be in another context, in a different culture. For example, in Western cultures, we tend to value eye contact, whereas in some Eastern cultures, that might be considered disrespectful. So intervening to teach someone to use eye contact wouldn't be ethical in the context that the behavior wasn't useful for that person. It's only relevant to teach skills and shape behavior when it's a valued skill or a skill that's required to access something else that's important. So if eye contact isn't required for those two reasons, then teaching it just for social conformity isn't a valid goal just in and of itself. Goals should be person-centered so that humans can thrive. We don't need to coerce them into normative boxes. We don't need everyone to behave or talk or look the same. And this perspective that I'm describing hasn't always been the norm. We can look back on history and see how things have changed over time. Most fields of medicine and psychology have problematic histories of mistreating minorities and individuals with disabilities. And these histories have long-term effects. The pursuit of sameness has caused much harm. My hope is that as a society, we are moving towards accepting and celebrating differences of all kinds, that we recognize people's value and worth, contribution, no matter the color of their skin, their culture, the language they speak, how they choose to communicate, or how their body or brain works. We should not be using behavior science to intervene when it's not needed, but let's use the science to move society forwards, to move towards acceptance and celebrating differences, because diversity makes us stronger. So what happens when people are not included? Many people experience barriers to inclusion that could be related to various domains, such as race, ethnicity, sexual or gender identity, and addressing these barriers is a human rights theme. Humans have a long history of tribalism, those behaviors that include one group and exclude another. Today, we're going to focus on barriers of inclusion for people with disabilities. Is someone not being included because of an impairment, or is it because of a public perception? Public perception can be an incredibly large barrier, and these perceptions in society are not easily changed because they've been around for a while. They affect everything, like how we think, our beliefs, the words we use, the design of environments. When it comes to how we treat individuals with disabilities, the reality is that if you don't currently have an impairment or a disability right now, there is a likelihood that you will at some point in your life, and you may need others to care for you. Physical and mental impairments can happen to anyone at any point in their life as a result of genetic conditions, illness, accident, aging, or other causes. These impairments are common experiences of being human, and how we respond as individuals and as a society reflects our own perceptions and beliefs. If we create a society that's designed to include and support all humans, no matter their ability, it will benefit all of us. There are a couple different ways to look at disability that I'd like to point out. So the medical model of disability frames an individual's impairments as the cause for their challenges to participate in society the way others do. So this model frames the body of the person with an impairment as a condition that's wrong or needs to be fixed. For example, a person in a wheelchair is not able to go up the stairs to access the building because they are not able to walk. So the responsibility lies on the person who cannot walk. And this can sometimes lead to feelings of social exclusion and inequality. The social model of disability suggests that people wouldn't be restricted from participating in the world around them if society was constructed in a way that was accessible for people with disabilities. So this model puts the responsibility on society rather than the individual. For example, buildings are designed and constructed with ramps. The social model points out that a condition is only disabling when it prevents someone from doing what they want or need to do. Within the social model of disability, there's a distinction between impairments and disabilities. Impairments can be understood as functional limitations, like not being able to walk or not being able to see, needing to wear glasses. Whereas disabilities are disadvantages imposed by society. So treating the impairment of not walking as abnormal and then excluding a person. Impairments don't necessarily equate to disability if the right accommodations and supports are provided. If someone who requires glasses to see is given glasses, then they don't necessarily have a disability because they've been given the accommodations that they need. Neurodiversity is the view that within the human population, there are normal variations in neurological functioning. There's no one right way of thinking or learning or behaving. Differences do not need to be viewed as deficits and shouldn't be stigmatized. We should understand and accept these differences rather than making others fit into predetermined molds. There are many valid ways to experience being human. It's important to work to change attitudes and perceptions and expectations so that we can expand our view of human differences. Neurodiversity is a non-medical term, and it's used to describe mental or neurological functions that differ from what's considered typical. It was first coined by the Australian sociologist Judy Singer, and then it was later used by Harvey Bloom, who presented neurodiversity as a component of biodiversity. Just as the ecosystem requires biodiversity to thrive, the human species needs neurological variation to thrive. And today, the neurodiversity movement is primarily a social justice movement, and it's propelled issues of disability rights in areas like education, clinical practice, research. The term neurodiversity was first used by the autistic activist community, and the vocabulary of neurodivergence has expanded to encompass any person whose brain works differently from the norm. There's no medical criteria for being considered neurodivergent, and any individual may or may not choose to identify as part of this group. The conditions here are common among those who choose to self-identify as neurodivergent. It's possible to identify as neurodivergent, but not consider yourself to have a disability or an impairment. It could just mean that you have a different neurotype, and that can be an asset in many scenarios. And it's important to remember that all of these categories are just words created by other people to group things together, to group certain characteristics that humans have in order to understand and treat. Humans like to categorize things into boxes, helps us understand. And this can be really helpful in certain contexts, but it also can be problematic. Humans don't fit neatly into one box or another. There's so much variation and overlap between all of these categories that we create. I'd be very surprised if this list looked exactly the same in 20 years, because how we understand humans is constantly changing, just like our language is constantly changing. So understanding your child starts with understanding what's appropriate and expected for their developmental stage. Oftentimes I see parents have concerns about something their kid is doing, but it's a very expected and typical process of developmental learning. For example, around age 3, kids start experimenting with lying. And knowing that this is a developmentally appropriate thing can help parents to understand that it might just be part of their current learning stage. There might not need to be something to worry about or plan for when you realize it's just part of their learning process. And we can't expect kids to go above and beyond their current developmental stage. Sometimes the developmental stage doesn't always match their chronological age. So even if your child is 6 years old, they may not have the same developmental skills of a 6-year-old sitting next to them. They might be at a different developmental stage that's similar to the 4-year-old sitting next to them. There's a lot of variation in those developmental milestones. Also, in order to understand your child, you have to understand that they change. They change over time. They also change depending on the context they're in, depending on the environmental variables. Your child will go through many different phases. Things will be smooth sailing for a while, and then you might hit a bumpy patch. Those ups and downs are a very common part of parenting. It's also important to understand your child's diagnosis if they have one. Sometimes when you receive a diagnosis, you have to take some time and process, what does that mean? How do you want to talk about it? What words do you want to use? Diagnosis, disability, difference. There can be so many different ways to think about and talk about these things. Diagnosis can be one part of understanding your child's needs, but it doesn't have to be a life sentence or an end-all, be-all description of your child. It could be one piece of the puzzle in understanding them. We don't want to put any limitations on our child's view of themselves and what they're capable of. Labels can be helpful in some context to give you information to help you understand or find resources that could help. But they also can be harmful if there's an over-attachment to those labels or a rigidity around what they mean. No person is defined by one thing. We are complex beings with ever-changing skills and abilities. How we talk about differences and disabilities can have a big impact on perceptions, and your kid's going to pick up on that. There's a movement towards changing how we think about mental health support and the language around some of these labels. For example, I've heard that in Europe, there's some people who are advocating for words like autism spectrum diagnosis rather than disorder. I'm really looking forward to the day when they rename ADHD, because it's not always an attention deficit or a disorder. It can also be an amazing gift of hyperfocus and hyperattention in certain contexts. And there are some leaders within the field of contextual behavior science that are working on trying to take down the DSM, to replace it with a mental health system that's less focused on pathologizing and more focused on individual health and well-being. Every human needs mental health support at some point in their life. Getting that support shouldn't be contingent on getting a diagnosis that fits within the health insurance medical model. So how do you talk to your kids about difference and about inclusion and fairness? Is it fair that some students have access to certain things in school to help them be successful when other kids see that and wonder, like, why don't I get the same thing? Is it special treatment? Is it fair? Is it the child's responsibility to do what everyone else in school is doing? Or is it the school's responsibility to provide accommodations to fit that child's needs? What's fair? These are really important questions, and kids have this natural inclination towards wanting things to be fair and wanting to understand the rules. And this can often come up with siblings. And those conversations about fairness are really important to have with siblings and other family members. I really like this image because it shows you here in this first picture what it might be like if everyone is given an equal size box. So you can see it helps this one person here with the red shirt, but for the person in the purple shirt, the one box isn't enough to meet their needs. And the other person in the blue shirt doesn't need a box. So then you look at the middle picture and we see the box was moved so that the person in the purple shirt has two boxes and now they can see over the fence. So everyone has been given accommodations that they need to see the ball game. Everyone doesn't have an equal box, but everyone's needs have been met and everyone can see the game. And then the third picture shows what it would be like if we just removed the barriers altogether. Just get rid of the fence so that everyone can see the ball game regardless of their height or abilities. Oftentimes, when we change the environment to accommodate for people with disabilities, it actually benefits everyone. Fairness does not always mean treating everyone exactly the same. Fairness is treating others equitably, considering their needs, considering their history, considering their skill level. It isn't fair to expect someone to be able to see over that fence without accommodations. It isn't fair that we expect our kids to learn or do things exactly the same way as their siblings or their classmates. We want our children to feel accepted for who they are exactly as they are in this moment, not who they could be, but who they are right now. And we want to give them the space to be who they are and know that we will love and accept them no matter what. So how do we do that as parents? How do we let our kids know that they belong and they're accepted? For many parents, acceptance begins by challenging our assumptions. We may need to broaden our view of what is normal or typical, broaden our view of a meaningful and productive life. A society that views people as only being useful when they're independent and financially productive has a very narrow view. We want to expand or broaden that. All people deserve equal human rights. Everyone can contribute to society. And there are so many different ways to live a happy, meaningful, and productive life. Accepting neurodiversity is enjoying that variety of life. Accepting neurodiversity also means validating and accepting all people and recognizing that differences do not always need to be changed or corrected. Neurodivergence is not inherently pathological, but people should be embraced and accepted into society as they are. People with neurological variations are not broken or incomplete versions of humans. Variation is an important part of humanity. People with atypical brains are fully human, valuable members of society. Ableism is discrimination and social prejudice against people with disabilities or those perceived to be disabled. And this form of discrimination favors non-disabled people, and in ableist societies, disabled people might be considered less worthy or less valuable. This discrimination is based on this belief that typical abilities are superior and that disabled people require fixing. It's similar to racism and sexism because it classifies entire groups of people as less than, and it often includes stereotypes, misconceptions, and overgeneralizations of whole groups of people. And with other forms of oppression, it can be intentional or unintentional. People don't always know that they're being ableist because ableism is so ingrained in our culture and our language Often people don't even recognize it's there until it's pointed out. And it has a long history. Society has engaged in large and small discrimination towards disabled people throughout history, such as the eugenics movement of the early 1900s, the mass murder of disabled people in Nazi Germany. There are a lot of words and metaphors used in our everyday language that are ableist. For example, words like crazy, psycho, dumb, insane, or phrases like falling on deaf ears, blind leading the blind. We may not even realize the negative impact that these words could be having, but language matters. How someone chooses to view and talk about their impairment or their disability or neurodivergence is going to vary from person to person. Some might lean towards the medical model of disability, whereas others might lean more towards the social model of disability. This is an individualized process. It doesn't have a standard one-size-fits-all approach. You might choose to avoid using any kind of label or diagnosis with your child, and when they're older, they might choose the opposite. Neurodiversity advocates encourage non-judgmental and inclusive language. Many people in the autistic community prefer identity-first language rather than person-first language. So saying an autistic person rather than a person with autism. When I was in grad school a long time ago, it was very strongly suggested that we use person-first language. So we would say the man with autism, the man would come first. But now there seems to be a shift that more people are preferring identity-first language, autistic man, where man is second. I think rather than making an assumption that any one opinion represents the whole community, it's best just to ask someone their preferred use of language, or listen and reflect the words that they use. Just like we're starting to get in the habit of asking people their preferred pronouns, we can learn to adapt language to be more inclusive. Accepting neurodiversity means that we have to examine our own assumptions about others. It means we have to consider whether our labels of weakness or deficit are more about our own perceptions. Perhaps some of those weaknesses are really strengths in disguise, because normal doesn't actually exist. Normal is just a setting on the dryer. It's important to examine why something might make us uncomfortable. Rather than assuming someone else needs to change, we can consider changing our own perspective. Think about a time when you were out and about in the community and you saw somebody that looked or behaved differently. What thoughts and feelings showed up for you? Can you notice your own assumptions? And can you notice them with kindness and curiosity? I'll give you an example about examining our assumptions around what it looks like to learn. So do you all remember back in April 2020, we all had to move to virtual learning and nobody really knew what we were doing. We were all kind of fumbling through it. And I remember this one afternoon when I was in the kitchen, and my son, he was in second grade at the time. He was logged into his live classroom. His webcam was on, his teacher was getting ready to start this lesson, and she started to explain her expectations for the students to show whole body listening. And so she was describing, what that was. It means sitting still and not moving your hands and feet, not playing with anything, sitting and looking at the camera and listening to the lesson. And so I was overhearing this and I was starting to get kind of nervous about how my son was doing with this expectation, because I knew this was going to be a hard one for him. And so I peeked in at him in the other room and I found him. He was looking at the screen and his body was still, but he was upside down. He was in a perfectly balanced headstand right in front of his Chromebook, looking at the teacher, paying attention, but clearly upside down and visible to his class that way. It's I don't think that probably qualifies as whole body listening to the teacher, but I just had to laugh. And It was 2020. So what else were we supposed to do at that moment? I knew there was no way I was going to be able to make my 8-year-old son sit still and not move his body and listen to an online class. So I just let him stay in the headstand and I went back to the kitchen. I knew that if I forced him to sit still without moving and appear like he was paying attention, he might be actually spending more energy on that than he would be on learning. This assumption of what it looks like to be learning is something that I see a lot in the school environment. Why do we assume that sitting still without moving and looking in a certain direction equals the ideal learning position? For many kids, including my own, they do better, they learn better when they have the freedom to move or fidget or doodle. If we're not examining those assumptions, we might be focused on the wrong thing. Is it more important to get kids to sit still and look like they're listening? Or is it more important to make accommodations for them so that they can learn in the best way for their body? This is something an autistic student said, which I think is really powerful. We are freshwater fish in salt water. Put us in freshwater and we function just fine. Put us in salt water and we struggle to survive. Individuals who are neurodivergent might face challenges doing things that come easily to neurotypical people. This is often because the environment is designed for neurotypical people, but when accommodations are made to support neurodivergent individuals, those obstacles decrease. Many of the learning environments or environments of employment are not designed for neurodivergent folks. But when they're placed in supportive environments that adapt to their needs, then they thrive. Another relevant quote that you may have heard is, when a flower isn't blooming, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. There are many ways to provide accommodations at home and in the community. There's been some recent developments within the IT field that represent accommodations. So in the interview process, some neurodivergent people struggle. Sometimes they're not meeting a social expectation, and that prevents them from accessing certain opportunities. What some of these IT companies have been doing is not relying on a person's ability to have a successful verbal interview, which might involve multiple social skills, eye contact, but doing the interviews instead that incorporate work performance, problem-solving tasks, rather than just that verbal conversation. And the interview process has allowed for some neurodivergent people to be more successful in this way, rather than just relying on an interview. They're able to perform a task and demonstrate their task rather than just the social verbal skills of the interview setting. And I think this came about because they were overlooking talent by focusing on social skills rather than the more important systematizing skill that was needed for the job. And then when they readjusted their interview process, they found it provided them the benefit that they were able to hire people who were a better fit for the job that maybe previously they passed over because of a difference of social expectations in the interview process. It's important to accept people and to provide necessary support for them. So it's possible to appreciate and accept characteristics of neurodivergent people and also recognize that some experience significant challenges and impairments that can have a huge impact on their life, on the life of their family members. There is some pushback or criticism of the neurodiversity movement by family members who are caring for individuals who are severely affected and require intensive support. Their concern is that they want to ensure that neurodivergent folks who do have more of an ability to speak out about their experience don't eclipse other voices. They want to make sure that the promotion of accepting neurodiversity doesn't lead to a decrease of resources or services for those whose day-to-day lives really depend on them. Neurodivergent individuals often need support in a variety of ways. All require understanding and acceptance. Many require accommodations, adapting or changing the environment, skill building opportunities. Certain skills may take more practice, positive behavior supports, working with their interests and their motivations, not using coercion, therapy, mental health support. All of these can be important tools. And all of these approaches should be person-centered and aimed at helping people live their best lives without the end goal of changing or altering the core of who they are. It's especially important to respect and honor different forms of communication. Some people use AAC devices to communicate. Others use sign language or written word. Communication is communication, and it should be honored no matter the format. It's important to be sensitive to all forms of communication, especially body language. Just because a person does not speak doesn't mean they don't understand what others are saying or have something to say themselves. Whatever skills a person has, it's important to teach them how to access the things that are meaningful to them. This may be learning to care for themselves, have a job, socialize with peers. The important thing is that every person has the right to as much self-determination as possible. Respecting other ways of being also means respecting that not all children develop skills in the same way or at the same time. Many neurodivergent kids will excel in one area and struggle in another area. It's important to focus on the skills and interests that they do have and build upon those. We must challenge our assumptions and methods of measuring intelligence. There's way more variation than our normative assessments can consider. Another way of respecting other ways of being is letting others let their guard down and be themselves. For some, there's great psychological stress and cost to fitting in and changing themselves for others or masking who they really are. It can be exhausting. It's better to allow them to spend their energy on the things that really matter rather than trying to fit them into a neurotypical world. In many situations, we can make changes to community settings to relieve some of the burden that people face. For example, having wheelchair accessible spaces, including Braille on signs, sensory friendly spaces, noise canceling headphones, visual pictures and prompts. We don't want our kids to feel like the burden rests solely on them. We can always seek to make changes in the environment to help an individual feel supported and included so that the responsibility is shared across society. So here's a question to ask yourself. Are there differences about my child that are difficult for me to accept? What are the if only stories that show up about your child? If only they stopped doing this, everything would be okay. Or if only they learned how to do XYZ, things would be better. If only they didn't have this diagnosis. Do you have assumptions or perceptions that get in the way of being fully present with your child in this moment with them and exactly the way they are? How can you parent out of a place of unconditional love and acceptance rather than a place of fear or discomfort? What can you do today to show your child that you love and accept them just as they are? We've talked about understanding and accepting, and now let's talk about celebrating. There's so much to celebrate in these kids and the amazing little beings that they are. Being neurodivergent or caring for someone who's neurodivergent can be wild, wonderful, and stressful every day. When we slow down and notice the small things, it helps us to find the beauty in the everyday events and interactions. Each day of life we're given can be miraculous and magical. Think about the last time your child surprised you, or last time they made you laugh. Those moments are like gold. You want to collect them, treasure them. Imagine how boring the world would be if we were all the same and had all the same skills. Diversity is what makes life interesting. We need all kinds of brains in the world. And it's important not just to understand and accept others, but to celebrate them. Many neurodivergent individuals have extraordinary skills in areas like memory, creativity, attention to detail, problem-solving skills. There are many neurodiverse people who have been able to accomplish things because of their neurodiversity in a way that no one else was able to do. I'm lucky that I have many neurodivergent people in my life. Some of them are artists, scientists, entrepreneurs, and I recognize there's this very special quality of someone who thinks differently, who's willing to push boundaries, question norms, take risks, or see things from a different angle. There are so many neurodivergent people who have done amazing things. This is a small list. There's many more. This list includes scientists, entertainers, athletes, inventors, captains of industry, all who've made significant contributions to their field. And in this list, the names that have an asterisk next to them are historical figures. So they've been hypothesized to be neurodivergent, but they weren't actually given a diagnosis at the time. So how can you celebrate your child? What strengths does your child have that you can recognize and help encourage? What kind of special interests do they have? How can you support that? How can you celebrate the skills that they already have? Maybe they have a keen sense of direction. They can remember how to get somewhere. Or maybe they can draw or make music. Maybe they excel at chess or Rubik's cubes. Or maybe it's just their ability to immerse themselves in a new topic of interest, or their perseverance, that even though learning is difficult, they don't give up. They keep trying. Each step is important to celebrate. No matter where they are, you can find something to celebrate. Humans have done amazing and wonderful things in this world, and we can celebrate the fact that many of those amazing things came from people who didn't always fit in. Many did not fit in the box of the school system or social expectations. And yet we all benefit from the accomplishments and advancements that have come from neurodivergent people. So we've covered a lot of topics today, and what I would love for you to keep asking yourself is, how can I practice understanding, accepting, and celebrating my child every day as they are? And then consider, when is it time to intervene and when is it time to not intervene? Consider your own perceptions of difference and also how that perception is communicated to your child, both with your words and your actions. Examine those assumptions, examine those perspectives. What are the ways that you can help your child feel supported and accepted for who they are right now? I hope that we can all work within our own communities to notice and address barriers to inclusion so that everyone can find their place and be supported, because not all great minds think alike. Well, that is it for this class. Thank you for being here. In the next class, we will begin part 2 of this course, where we'll focus on learning new skills.